So today's video is about inner child healing. Now, within the self-help and psychology community, we're hearing a lot more about the inner child, but what I'm going to be discussing today is more so the wounded inner child. So what is the inner child? Well, for me, I consider the inner child the aspect of our consciousness that did not evolve with the rest of us, okay? It's essentially the aspect of our consciousness that became fractured and stuck in time. Well, how does that happen? For consciousness to evolve and progress, it has to flow, it has to move through. So these parts of ourselves did not evolve with the rest of us when they became stuck, when they weren't allowed to flow. Essentially, the emotions and feelings that arise during childhood, they need to be felt and experienced. And when we are not allowed to internalize and process them, what ends up happening is this part of us becomes stuck, right? And this aspect of our consciousness still stays in a childlike state, all right? This often happens at any moments where we went into a fight, flight, or freeze response as children, right? Maybe that we dropped a plate on the ground, right? And the mom yelled at us and we contracted and we just went, oh, right? And our safety was threatened. And then we weren't allowed to feel or process the feelings in that moment because we had to go into survival. So what ends up happening is when these aspects of our energy become blocked or separate, right? We will create a lot of coping mechanisms and defense walls around these aspects of ourselves, right? So this looks like someone who is a perfectionist, for example, okay? Maybe they were told they weren't good enough when they were growing up, so they adapted perfectionism as a coping mechanism from having to feel the shame and guilt that they experienced as children, right? So they're always going to be getting straight A's or always at the top of the class because they don't want to encounter that aspect of their consciousness that is still carrying all that shame from childhood. So how do we recognize our inner child, right? To heal our inner child, we have to at least first be aware of when it's coming up, okay? So certain external events can come into our lives and really break down these protection mechanisms and these defense walls that we created around the shame and guilt that we're carrying from childhood, okay? So like I said, back to our example of being a perfectionist, maybe something arises where your career as a star athlete is done. Or you being at top of the class, there's some tragedy or something where you can't carry out that level of success anymore, all right? So when those walls come down, the inner childlike consciousness will come back out. And we recognize it because this aspect of our consciousness will still be very childlike. And so children exist in a world of duality. It's called splitting. They have very black and white thinking. Children cannot contextualize certain situations. For them, there is no gray area, okay? The children see the world in extremes, all right? So you really will notice when your inner child self is coming out, when you begin to fully internalize or externalize a certain situation. When you find yourself taking on all the blame for something, saying, I'm so bad, this is all on me, this is all my fault, that's your inner child coming out. Or you could fully externalize the situation, right? Which is, this is all their fault. They're in the wrong. I'm perfect. I'm doing everything right. As we said, children are very egocentric. They really can't perceive anything outside of themselves. So if you're kind of caught in this mode where your thinking can't really think outside of what's going on beyond yourself, you're likely triggered back into a wounded inner child state. Also, we notice when our wounded inner child, is coming out when we're experiencing extreme levels of fear and anxiety that really in a situation that doesn't necessarily warrant that response, okay? So this is often because as children we were helpless and powerless, right? So when we're re-experiencing that helplessness and powerlessness as adults, even though it's not necessarily the same, right? We can take more control, we have more ability to exert power in these situations, right? When we're experiencing that level of fear and anxiety that we would experience as a child, that means that our inner child is coming out in that moment. So then, how do we heal the inner child? Healing these aspects of ourselves, it requires us to reconnect with them and constantly work with them, okay? And so At first, we always have to bring awareness to when our inner child is coming out, right? When this hurt aspect of ourselves that are carrying these emotions we weren't able to feel during childhood begins to arise, all right? So we begin to notice when we're triggered. Notice when you're starting to enter into that fight, flight, or freeze response that seems to be related back to something from childhood. What you need to do is you now need to accept full responsibility, okay? You're an adult now. So deep breathe, calm down, and be aware that you are in full control of this present moment, okay? As a child, you felt out of control, but you need to let the body know that this is now different, all right? We need to kind of rewire these pathways. Politely disengage from the triggering event. So maybe it's your partner that has triggered you back into this wounded inner child state. Politely tell them, look, I'm being triggered from something back in childhood. I may be overreacting. I just need to separate myself now and just kind of gather myself, okay? So disengage from it. Go to a safe space. Go into a room or wherever else where you can be alone, right? Or at least around people that can be supportive and hold space for you. When that occurs, when you finally find that space where you feel safe and secure, you have to begin to feel into the emotions and feelings that you had to repress from childhood. Oftentimes, it is surrendering into the powerlessness and helplessness we felt as children. Because as children, we are fully dependent on our caretakers to meet our needs. But when our caretakers were negligent or not responsible, it is one of the scariest things ever, and we have to detach from that pain because it can be too much to feel in that moment. Now you have the space and ability to step in and feel what it was like to be that powerless and helpless, vulnerable child. Our last step is when after the emotions flow through, is to reparent this wounded inner child. Reparenting means becoming the caregiver that you may have lacked in that moment. That means being firm and calm. That means being understanding, but holding this aspect of yourself accountable as well, right? It is basically being compassionate. It is letting that negative inner critic that says, oh, we're so bad or we're so terrible, countering that voice, telling yourself, hey, we're doing the best we can. Yes, we need to be responsible. Yes, we need to hold ourselves to a bit of a higher standard. But I understand why we're doing what we're doing right now. I understand why we're scared. It's essentially you need to validate your own experiences because for many of us as children, our experiences, our feelings and emotions likely weren't validated the way they were supposed to. This is an ongoing, continuous process. I even noticed my inner child coming out the other night, right? So, but each and every time you're reconnecting, and when you're reconnecting and you go through these steps, this part of yourself evolves. And the coping mechanisms and the defense walls that you had to create around this thing no longer have to be a part of your personality. The sad truth is that most of our personalities are merely just coping mechanisms and protection walls around the wounded inner child aspects of ourselves. Thank you for watching this video. Please